If you ever thought nothing could be worse than being betrayed, try imagining this: you gift $84,500 for your brother's wedding, only to get a call saying you are no longer on the guest list. I'm Cassandra Whitaker, 34 years old, founder of the Aurora Grand Hotel chain in Colorado, and today I was crossed off the wedding I paid for. Noah's wedding, my brother's. It's not that I showed up late. It's not that I did something wrong. I just didn't fit the atmosphere they wanted to create. Sounds strange, right? Picture this. You get a call from the wedding planner, a person you've never met, speaking in a voice cold as ice: Miss Cassandra. The family wants to keep the venue, the catering, the entire package, but they do not want you to attend. I had to grab the edge of the desk just to keep my knees from buckling. I stood there, inside my own executive office, the very place where I've signed hundreds of contracts, hired and fired staff, and negotiated with the most difficult investors, and I couldn't utter a single word. Because this wasn't business. This was blood. Noah and I aren't just siblings. We were survivors together after our parents' brutal divorce. When my mom, Lorraine Sanchez, was busy rebuilding her life, and my dad, Robert Whitaker, started another family. Noah and I only had each other. I once worked 3 jobs at the same time just to chase my dream of going to college. Noah worked construction in freezing snow, sending me $500 every month even though he was only in trade school. We were a team, an unspoken vow no one gets left behind. And now that vow turned to dust in a phone call that lasted less than 2 minutes. Noah met Vivian Hallbrook a year ago. She comes from a family so wealthy it's practically obscene. Her mother, Marilyn, is the living definition of old money pearls even on a golf course, and talking to waiters like she's giving commands to a dog. I saw it at the very first dinner we had together. Vivian opened with this line: "Oh, so you're the sister who runs hotels. Fascinating. I've always been curious about people in the service industry. For example, I manage a laundromat instead of owning a 5-star hotel chain certified by Travel Luxe. But I bit my tongue because Noah loved her, and I loved Noah. So when they said they wanted to host the wedding at Aurora Grand, I volunteered to cover the entire cost of the venue, catering, and accommodations for VIP guests, a total of $84,500. I remember signing the check right before Christmas, thinking this will be the biggest gift I'll ever give as a sister, and now I don't even have a seat at the ceremony. No invitation, no handwritten note, no explanation. And me, I'm still being used as the anonymous sponsor. The worst part, they actually think I'm going to swallow this like an overly sweet piece of wedding cake. I'm Cassandra Whitaker. And if they think they can kick me out of the wedding and still keep my money, they just opened a war they cannot even begin to imagine. Sometimes, you just know you're being lied to. Not because the lie is particularly strange, but because it's coming from someone who once swore they'd never lie to you. There must be some kind of mix-up. Cass, maybe there's a glitch with the guest list. I'll talk to Vivian. That was the first thing Noah said when I called him, trying to sound composed even though I could clearly hear the clinking of wine glasses somewhere in the background. I gripped the phone tighter, my nails digging into my palm. "You didn't know?" I asked, my voice calm as if I were inquiring about the weather. Victoria Hayes, your wedding planner, called my office directly to inform me I was no longer on the guest list, but my $84,500 still in use? Silence. Just soft jazz playing in the distance and someone laughing too loudly. "Cass, I'm sorry." Okay, Vivian thought. Her mother thought. This would make things more comfortable. I let out a dry laugh, bitter enough to surprise even myself. More comfortable for whom? Noah. For Vivian, the woman who's been in your life for not even 2 summers. Or for Marilyn, the one who refers to me as the hotel lady instead of the groom's sister. I just didn't want to upset anyone. So you chose to upset me. Noah sighed, and his voice grew more earnest. You know I didn't mean it that way. I'm just caught in the middle. I don't want to start my new life with conflict. Your new life. I cut in, built on $84,500 and the absence of the one person who's always been there for you. Noah said nothing. We used to have an unspoken rule never hang up on each other while the other was still talking. That night, Noah broke it. The next morning, I received an email, not from my brother, from Vivian. Subject regarding Cassandra's attendance at the wedding. Exactly 3 lines long. No greeting, no dear, no thank you. We apologize for not notifying you sooner. Due to the sensitive nature of the event, we've had to limit the guest list to align with our family's media and image strategy. We ask for Ms. Cassandra's understanding. Sincerely, Ms. Cassandra. I once packed up Noah's entire apartment when he broke his leg, slept in a hospital chair 3 nights straight when he had his appendix removed, took out a business loan under my company's name to cover his credit card debt during the pandemic. But to his fiancée, I was now just Ms. Cassandra. Fitting, I guess. When a bank account has legs, who needs a nickname, I asked, to meet Noah in person. We sat across from each other in a cafe that used to be our go-to spot back in high school, where every mocha was split in 2 because we couldn't afford our own. This time, he ordered an espresso, drank it in one go, never looked me in the eye. I'm sorry Vivian doesn't understand our past, he began. I let out a laugh, the kind that scrapes the pity right out of your throat. The issue is, you didn't make her understand. Cass, don't blow this out of proportion. I'm still me. You're still you. The wedding is just 1 day. Family is forever. No, Noah. Family isn't forever. If you erase the person who built your past just to match the filters on your wedding photos. He didn't argue. He didn't cry. He just looked at me quietly for a long time, then spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. Vivian said, "You overshadow her, that I'll never grow up if I keep living in the shadow of my successful sister." I sat still. The ice in my glass had melted, leaving a small puddle on the old wooden table. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't about a wedding. This was about how I'd never been truly seen in my own family. Not because I didn't love enough, but because I was too strong to be controlled. So, if they chose to write me out of the story, should I quietly walk away, or should I start rewriting the rules from scratch? I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was angry, not because I was hurt, but because there was only one question echoing in my mind, over and over again. How far have I let them disrespect me? I lay on the king-size bed inside the penthouse on the top floor of Aurora Grand, the very room I once dreamed of back when I used to sleep on a studio couch. And yet here I was, lying on my own bed, inside my own hotel. And somehow, it felt like I'd been exiled from my own home. I stared up at the ceiling. The chandelier cast soft golden light across the walls. Everything looked luxurious, perfect. But inside me, there was only this hollow silence, stretching endlessly, I didn't cry, not because I was strong, but because tears no longer carried enough power to express that tight, suffocating ache. I used to believe I was a good sister. I used to think that if I tried hard enough, if I kept giving in, taking on all the sacrifices, shouldering all the losses, then no one would ever dare to betray me. I used to believe love was enough, but no. To some people, love is only worth an $84,500 check, and once that amount has been handed over, whether you exist or not, it no longer matters. I remembered Vivian's phone call, her voice soft as silk, sharp as glass. Cassandra, you have to understand, sometimes stepping back is the best thing you can do to let someone else shine. I almost laughed when I heard the word sister. She had never used that word before, but this time, she knew she had to sound gentle, because I was still the owner of the hotel, and she needed that ballroom more than she needed her dignity. I turned and sat up. The clock read 2:14 a.m. In the dim blur of shadows, I walked toward the desk, opened the drawer, pulled out the copy of the wedding contract between Noah, Vivian, and my company. The last line on page 3 made me stop. Aurora Grand reserves the right to cancel or modify the event unilaterally in the case of reputational damage, ethical breach, or misuse of the relationship. I wrote that line with my own hand. It was supposed to be a clause to protect the brand, but now it felt like it was speaking directly to me. Cassandra, are you really going to let them use your name, your effort, your money, only to push you out of the wedding like a shadow? I closed my eyes. Maybe, deep down, a part of me still hoped Noah would knock on my door, that he'd be standing there, like he used to, holding a bag of cheap donuts, saying I messed up. Cass, forgive me. Okay, but the truth was, I was alone. I was the one who swallowed too much disrespect and called it sacrifice. I was the one who ignored all the mocking remarks, the judgmental glances from Marilyn and Vivian. I thought keeping Noah happy was the highest priority. But what kind of happiness is built on erasing the very person who helped you stand? I placed the contract down, stood up, faced the mirror. I was no longer the girl who bit her lip and let things slide, no longer the sister who endured for the family, no longer the nameless sponsor carrying the Whitaker name. I put my hand on my chest. My heart was still beating fast, but steady. If they've drawn the line, then I'll step across it. A voice inside me whispered, clear, certain, no more trembling. But before I made my move, I needed to review everything I had ever given away, and every single thing they had quietly taken without so much as a thank you. There are things you don't write on a card, you don't include them in a wedding speech, you don't pin them to a Pinterest wedding board. No one ever told Vivian Cassandra was the one who put the first Range Rover under your name when your credit score was too low to get approved for a loan. No one ever mentioned at the engagement party if it hadn't been for his sister, the one who paid off 3 overdue tuition installments at the technical school. Noah wouldn't even have the degree that got him promoted to construction site manager. Nobody knows, except me. That morning, I opened my laptop. For the first time in months, I didn't read the revenue reports. I searched for evidence. I opened the folder called Family, Personal, the one I'd been hiding under a disguised name, Old Receipts. I scrolled down transfer dated April 3rd. $22,800, April rent payment on behalf of Noah. Transfer dated June 12th. 2021 $5,400, Full payment of Noah's Visa credit card debt. Loan guarantor confirmation. Vivian Hallbrook. Dated March 15th, 2022. Receipt for fall semester tuition. Colorado Tech Institute. Under Noah Whitaker's name. Paid through my company account. Each line appeared like stitches pulling together tears I never wanted to see. I helped them. Silently. Without expecting anything in return. Without asking for recognition. Because family is family, I once told myself. Because sometimes people just need a little help to start over. Because I can, so I should. But now, all those because feel like the pillow I've been clutching just to avoid seeing the truth I've been used. There was always a reasonable excuse to stay quiet. Always now isn't the right time. Always let's just let them be happy. And in that silence, I lost myself. I remember a time Noah called me past midnight. His voice was hoarse, almost breaking Cass. I can't cover the credit card payments anymore. My credit score tanked. Vivian doesn't know. Please, don't tell anyone. Okay, I wired the money the very next morning. No questions asked. Just texted him. Focus on getting back on your feet. Everything's fine now. Looking back, how many times did I cover for them? Only for them to erase me from the family picture I paid. I covered. I signed my name on their loans. And now, I've been cut out of the table like an employee who failed the dress code. I printed every single document, placed them neatly into a black folder, ran my fingers along the edge as if I was smoothing out the dignity I'd forgotten I still had. Good sister was a role I'd memorized by heart. But this play is over. I'm no longer here to explain myself. I won't open my heart again to people who chose to stand above me on things I gave them in the first place. I looked at the stack of printed papers. They weren't just invoices. They were history. They were fragments of being forgotten. And they were also weapons. It's time I stop living by promises and start acting on what I've already proven in cash. I never thought I would have to use Clause 14. But that morning, I reopened the official contract between Aurora Grand and Noah Whitaker, Vivian Hallbrook, signed by both parties at my attorney's office 4 months ago. It was a clear bilateral agreement. It had a termination clause. It had confidentiality obligations. It even included a provision about the right to cancel the event if any action is found to harm the reputation or ownership relationships. I wrote that clause myself after a former client once hosted a wedding at Aurora Grand, then posted a video humiliating one of our servers on TikTok, causing our brand to be dragged through the mud for an entire week. Since then, I understood one thing clearly. A brand doesn't just need revenue, it needs respect. I called Rachel Kim, my legal counsel. She was the very first person I hired when I opened Aurora Grand, a Korean-American woman, hair always tied high, speaking in a low, firm voice. Rachel, I need to review my rights to cancel a wedding contract if the other party violates clauses regarding ownership relationships and reputation. Silence for a second. Then Rachel asked, straight to the point, what did Vivian Hallbrook do? Not just Vivian, Noah, too. I told her everything, briefly but clearly, about the call from the wedding planner, about being erased from the guest list but still treated like a humanitarian ATM, about the 3-line email without a greeting, regarding my financial records. I have included everything from tuition fees to debt payments to cars registered under my name. Rachel wasn't surprised. She only said I'll draft an urgent termination guide. But Cassandra, before we send this, are you sure? I nodded. Even though she couldn't see me, I'm sure. They chose the line, "I'm just making it clearer." That afternoon, I printed the notice of intent to terminate the agreement, signed it, and placed it on the desk, right on top of the original contract, above Noah's signature, bold, messy ink strokes, next to the note I have read, understood, and agreed to all terms. Good. That means he understood that by choosing to exclude me from the big day, he had also crossed the boundary of family. I also wrote a short note to Victoria Hayes, the wedding planner they hired. "Victoria, thank you for being honest when you called me. I know you were just following instructions. But now, please forward this notice to Ms. Halbrook and Noah Whitaker. Aurora Grand will not proceed with their wedding unless my status as an honorary family member is reinstated." I clipped that note to the file, neatly, firmly, without emotion. That evening, I walked into the hotel's dining hall where the staff was testing the menu for the upcoming wedding. The air was filled with the scent of vanilla wedding cake, seared beef, and soft laughter. Anthony, my executive director, approached me, holding the menu list. "Are you sure?" he asked, his gaze no longer that of an employee, but of someone who had witnessed the entire journey. I've let them call me the annoying sister, the difficult hotel owner, and too ambitious to belong in the family photo. I said without hesitation. "Now, I'll let them call me what I choose, the one holding the keys. This game isn't over. But if I take away the keys, what will they have left? Besides promises hanging from silk ceilings the following afternoon?" My phone exploded. Not one call, not two, but 24 calls within 45 minutes. Unknown numbers, familiar numbers, private numbers, texts, emails, even DMs on Instagram. They all had one thing in common: PANIC, Cassandra. Maybe this is just a small misunderstanding. I'm sure we can renegotiate the terms. You can't do this. The wedding is in less than 2 weeks. I put the phone on speaker and set it on the table. Didn't touch it. Didn't need to rush. I poured myself a cup of Earl Grey, sat down on the armchair by the floor-to-ceiling window in the 15th floor conference room at Aurora Grand, the one that overlooked the Rocky Mountains. They thought they were fixing a technical glitch. But really, this was the cost of arrogance. Victoria Hayes, the wedding planner, was the first to call back, breathless like she had just run a marathon. "Cassandra, I just sent the notice to the Halbrooks. Marilyn is practically losing her mind. She's threatening to sue. Vivian's already called 3 other venue companies in the city, but they're all fully booked." I set the teacup down, tilted my head slightly, and smiled. "So, they know I'm not joking. Are you really going to cancel everything? I haven't canceled anything." "Victoria." I cut her off. "I've just given them a choice. Either I'm respected as a member of the family, or they figure out how to pitch a tent in the parking lot." 3 hours later, I received an official email from the Halbrook side, written by their attorney, complete with a flashy logo and 6 bold lines in all caps. "We consider this an illegal extortion attempt and will pursue appropriate legal action." I laughed. Extortion. I gave them the venue, provided the services, funded the money. I was cut off the guest list. No one apologized. And now, when I ask to be acknowledged, they call it extortion. No. This was an investment recovery for breach of agreement. By the end of the day, news about the Halbrook wedding fiasco started to leak. An anonymous event staffer posted on Reddit a mega-rich wedding in Denver got canceled at the last minute because the bride's family kicked the groom's sister out of the ceremony, but still tried to use her venue. Turns out, She's the CEO of a hotel chain. The comments exploded Team Sister all the way. Didn't they think about the consequences? Spent over 80 grand and then got kicked out of the wedding? I'd burn the entire ballroom. Bank accounts growing a spine. Yeah. I scrolled through the comments, not looking for support, but to remind myself I wasn't alone anymore. This was no longer just between Noah and me. No longer a family misunderstanding. This was a story about boundaries, about how much is too much, and when it's the right time to stand up and say, I gave you everything, but I won't let you walk all over me. When my phone buzzed for the 25th time, I glanced at the screen. Noah. I didn't pick up, not because I was angry, but because I was no longer the woman who waited. I was the one setting the terms. And when the terms aren't met, everything that follows is simply a consequence. 9:17 a.m., my phone rang. Anthony, the hotel manager, doesn't usually call, but this morning, he called 3 times in a row, just minutes apart. I picked up. His voice was urgent. Cassandra. They're here. All of them. Vivian, Marilyn, Noah, and a man I'm guessing is their attorney. Where are they? I stood up from my desk, subtly adjusting the collar of my blouse. Main lobby. They're demanding that you speak with them directly. They said it's an emergency and they're threatening to sue the hotel if they don't get a response today. I inhaled. Slowly. Emergency. Good. Now they know what it feels like to lose control. 9:43 a.m. I walked into the conference room on the 16th floor. Without being invited, Marilyn Hallbrook was already seated. Her face was pale, but her eyes still burned with arrogance. Vivian stood next to her, arms crossed, lipstick perfectly blended as if she were about to go live on national television. Noah was at the far end of the table, silent, his gaze no longer meeting mine. I looked straight at Marilyn. I have 20 minutes. Please begin. A man in a dark navy suit, salt and pepper hair, hurriedly flipped through his papers. We're filing an objection to the contract termination and requesting a review of the conditions for using Aurora Grand for the event on the 28th of this month. I placed a stack of files on the table, the contract, the termination notice, every email exchanged between me and Victoria. Clause 1403 has been executed in full compliance with the legal process. I am the authorized signatory. I had the right, and I exercised it. Vivian cut in, her voice cracking. Cassandra, this is my wedding. You can't just I can. And I already did. I interrupted, my tone steady, neither raised nor trembling. Marilyn slammed her hand on the table. You don't understand how many people this impacts. The press is blowing it up. Guests from New York have already booked flights. The wedding dress designer is threatening to cancel her entire production schedule without a venue, and now you're destroying my daughter's future political career. I only stopped them from destroying my dignity. This is personal retaliation. No, I replied, soft as a breeze. This is re-establishing boundaries. 11:02 a.m. A small press conference scheduled by the Hallbrook side was suddenly canceled. Internal reason given due to unresolved disagreements between parties involved. 11:30 a.m. I received an email from Rachel Kim, my attorney. They're seeking mediation. They're offering to return the full sponsorship amount of $84,500 and are requesting to keep the ceremony. I let out a quiet laugh. How interesting. Now they suddenly remember that money actually belongs to someone. But money was never my goal. 1:07 p.m. I walked into my office and opened the staff group chat. A new message from Anthony popped up at the top. The Halbrook group called the front desk 3 times, asking if they could put down another deposit to hold the date. They're panicking. I typed a single line. Put a freeze on any transactions related to them. I want them to understand that not every check can buy back the place they threw away. That evening, as I walked out of the hotel, I realized I wasn't afraid anymore. I no longer needed their apology. I no longer craved their validation, because now they were the ones seeking mine. But the question still lingered. Would they bow their heads, or keep pushing this to the point of explosion Friday night? I was in the middle of reviewing the event plan for next week's VIP guests when my phone started ringing. It was Noah. I hesitated for a second, then picked up. Cass. His voice was hoarse, tired, stripped of any resentment. Can we talk? I'm busy. I replied curtly. Please. Cass. I know I messed up. I know Vivian and her mother have taken things too far. I just didn't expect it all to turn out like this. I stayed silent. Noah went on. Can you at least say something? You can't just shut me out like this. I'm not shutting you out. I'm just putting myself exactly where you all chose for me to stand on the sidelines. His voice broke. There was a long, heavy sigh. You know, I haven't slept these past few days. Everything's a mess. Vivian's furious. Her mom is blaming everything on me. They say I'm useless, that I've ruined everything. I feel like some kind of clown at my own wedding. Then I guess that feeling is pretty close to how I felt when your bride kicked me off the guest list. Silence, long, stretched. Then Noah whispered. Almost to himself, I screwed up. I could hear the truth in his voice. No conference room, no legal advisors, just a younger brother falling apart. I was about to say something, but I didn't get the chance. A woman's voice cut in from the background. Vivian. Why are you calling her again? Don't let pity drag you back into being your old self. Noah, I heard every word. Not because she was loud, but because she wanted me to. She knew I was still on the line. She knew, and she said it on purpose. 2 hours later, I got an email from Marilyn. Subject line, we're all adults here. The body had only 3 lines, Cassandra. This has gone too far. I believe we can still find a compromise if you stop now. Families should not destroy each other like this. Act like a sensible woman. I reread the last line. A sensible woman. I used to be that kind of woman. Polite, modest, soft-spoken. The kind who stepped back so others could stand in the spotlight. And then, they shoved me off that stage without looking back? No, Mrs. Halbrook. I am not sensible anymore. I'm someone who knows exactly where the lines are drawn. And if you've ever been turned into a decoration, pushed to the sidelines in your own story, you are not alone. Have you ever had to choose between your dignity and keeping the peace? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might help someone else find their voice. And if any of this feels familiar, hit subscribe to Bitter Scars so we can uncover the stories no one ever tells. We deserve to be heard. We deserve to be seen. I closed my laptop. Outside, the city kept buzzing. But I knew a different kind of silence was settling over the Halbrook family, and I was about to shatter it. With the truth, I used to believe that staying silent was an act of grace. Everything I did for Noah, for Vivian, and for what they called my brother's new family was something I should do quietly. That speaking about the payments I covered, the loans I guaranteed, the things I overlooked, would make me seem petty. But when silence turns into invisibility and generosity gets twisted into obligation, then it's no longer grace. It's foolishness. I didn't go public with an angry post. I handled it. Strategically. I sent a copy of my personal financial records listing every single payment I'd made on Noah's behalf over the past 4 years to the PR advisor of the Holbrook Corporation, where Vivian's father happens to be an honorary board member. No accusations, no emotional commentary, just bank transfers, tuition receipts, car loan guarantees, and internal emails all stamped and verified. 12 hours later, I got a call from an unknown number, a veteran journalist who specialized in covering Denver's corporate elites. I know you're not looking for drama, but do you realize the impact of what you just sent? I exhaled slowly. I do, but I'm exhausted. Exhausted from being labeled the toxic sister after spending nearly $100,000. Exhausted from watching my kindness turned into the backdrop for someone else's spotlight. Exhausted from never being mentioned. Unless someone needed something. Are you willing to speak publicly? I don't need to be center stage. I just want people to know who turned on the lights so the show could begin. 3 days later, the article went live. Headline: $1 Million Bride, Groom Loses His Seat, and the woman behind the most lavish wedding gown in Colorado? No attacks, just facts. The opening line read, "The wedding wasn't canceled due to a lack of budget, but a lack of respect for the person who wrote the checks." I didn't share the article. I didn't have to. Messages started pouring in. Not from the media, but from people I never expected. My aunt in Florida, the one who once told me I should stop trying to control everything, sent just one line. "You should have done this a long time ago." An old college friend, the same one who disappeared after borrowing money from me in my sophomore year, sent a hesitant text. "I used to think you were too intense, but now you've made me feel stronger." Even a former employee, someone the Holbrook family once humiliated during a menu tasting, emailed me, "Thank you for speaking up. I still remember when you apologized on their behalf, even though it wasn't your fault." Noah said nothing. No denials. Not a single message. I guess he's finally seeing what he refused to see for the past year, who was truly standing beside him and who was simply using him to climb higher. I wasn't waiting for an apology. I wasn't waiting for anyone to see the light. I just needed to stand up once and say, "My name is Cassandra Whitaker. I'm no longer the anonymous benefactor, and this is my resignation letter from that role and them." They're now standing in the middle of an empty wedding hall, surrounded by imported flowers no one has paid for, staring at a guest list no one has bothered to confirm. Because when you build a castle on vanity and forget the person who poured the concrete, by the time the walls start cracking, you have no one left to call for repairs. After the article, after the email, after that moment, I put a period on the role of the sponsoring sister. Everything stayed silent for exactly 3 days. Then it started to come down like hailstones in the middle of a clear sky. A mutual friend texted me saying Vivian was calling every single guest, trying to explain that everything has been slandered, that Cassandra is playing the pity game, that I always feel abandoned whenever Noah is happy. I laughed. Not in pain, just tired. Lorraine Sanchez, my mother, had been silent ever since everything blew up. She didn't send a text, didn't take sides, didn't blame anyone, until she called at 8 p.m. On Tuesday, "You're making everything too public. Cass, family matters are private." I set the phone down on the table and turned on the speaker. "Mom, what do you think drove me to lose enough trust that I had to drag everything into the light? I'm not saying what you did was wrong. I just regret it. Because now there may not be a way back. Mom, is there even anything left to go back to silence? Then my mother sighed, very softly. I used to think you were too rational, too rigid. But now I see, maybe you've been alone longer than I realized. I froze. Those words are not quite an apology, but the closest thing to one I had ever heard from her. I didn't cry, but I folded my hands and rested my forehead on the back of my knuckles. Stayed still for a long while. Noah sent a message. Not many words. You won. Sis. I lost everything. But maybe. I deserved to lose. I didn't reply. Not out of bitterness, but because I was no longer in a fight. I'd walked off the ring long ago. If anyone lost, it was him losing to himself. Vivian, though, kept going. I heard she tried to hire a PR firm to manage the crisis, but dropped it after the company's own representative refused, saying it was involving public ethical disputes. She could be beautiful. She could be rich. But now, everyone knew who wore the ring and who built the stage. The wedding, of course, didn't happen. No venue would take them. There wasn't enough time. And there is not enough honor for anyone to want to collaborate. Noah quietly stepped away from his job. Vivian went back to her parents' home in Connecticut for a while. Marilyn lost her sponsorship seat on a cultural fund because of unresolved matters affecting community trust. I didn't gloat. I didn't smirk. I didn't celebrate. I just felt hollow. Not out of regret, but because I knew for certain that everything between Noah and me was shattered, no longer a glass you could glue back together. We used to be two kids using tin cans tied with a string as telephones across the hallway. Now, we're two adults sitting at opposite ends of our memories, with no string connecting us anymore. No hatred, no forgiveness, just different. And that was something I never thought I'd have to accept. But when different becomes the excuse people use to push you out, you're left without a choice. You walk away, alone. But with your head held high, they came to find me. A week after the wedding was canceled, after the third article went live, after Marilyn was stripped of her status as an honorary sponsor of the Colorado State Cultural Council, they showed up, unannounced, at the cafe where I always sat alone, at the exact hour. I usually came by as if someone had tried to stage a very clumsy coincidental scene. Noah, Mom, and Vivian. Vivian stood slightly behind, sunglasses on, still wearing that oversized cream trench coat, as if she were playing the misunderstood heroine in some old movie. Mom looked uneasy, dark circles under her eyes, but she was still forcing herself to keep that peacemaker posture. And Noah, he was the only one who met my eyes directly. Cass, can you sit with us for 5 minutes? I looked at him. The boy who once carried me through a snowstorm when I sprained my ankle. The boy who once scribbled on a pizza box lid, Cass. The reason I keep trying. Now. The man standing in front of me looked like he needed permission just to exist in my life. I nodded, didn't invite them to sit. We sat at the table by the window. No one spoke for the first 10 seconds. I stirred my coffee. Noah placed his hand on the table and pulled it back. Placed it down again. Finally, Mom spoke. Cass, I didn't come here to justify anything. I want you to know, I don't want to lose you, no matter what's happened. I lifted my head, slowly. You never had me to lose, Mom. You had an image of me, the dependable sister, the independent daughter, the one who never needed anyone to check on her, always ready to pull out her wallet. But that wasn't me. That was the most convenient version of me you and Noah ever needed. Vivian gave a short nasal laugh. Not loud, but loud enough for me to hear it. I turned to her. Do you find something funny I just think? You seem to be enjoying playing this justice victim role. And, honestly, if we're being fair, you hold quite a lot of power here. I set my coffee cup down, softly, but firmly. You're wrong. I don't enjoy power. I just refuse to let anyone keep using me as their backdrop. Vivian opened her mouth to respond, but Noah cut her off. Viv, not now. He turned to me. Cass, I don't know what to say to fix this, but I'll never forgive myself if I don't at least try. I looked straight into my brother's eyes, and for the first time, I said the thing I'd been avoiding for years. You don't need me. Noah, you need an unconditional investor, someone who never asks for anything back. And I played that role for far too long. You thought it was real. No, that's not it. You let people treat me like the hired help at your wedding. You let them cut me out, drag my name through the mud, and you sat there, silent. I don't need an apology anymore. I need you to understand that was never, ever normal. Noah stayed quiet, then lowered his head, in a way I'd never seen from him before, not from shame, but from knowing there was nothing left to defend. I stood up, picked up my coat. I'm done pretending we're a loving family. Maybe we were once, but we're not anymore. And saying that out loud, that's not failure. I walked away, didn't look back. For the first time in years, I didn't need anyone behind me to feel whole enough. I used to be most afraid of silence. Those moments right after the door slammed shut, after footsteps faded away, after a message went unanswered. I used to hate silence because it made me feel invisible. It is as if, unless I filled the space with actions, words, or kindness, I would simply be forgotten. But this time, after leaving the cafe where all the pretending had finally come undone, I went home, turned on the lights, made myself a cup of mint tea, and didn't play any music. I didn't make a call. I didn't need any sound at all. Just silence. And I found myself there, clearer than ever before. I sat down on the white sofa, placed the tea beside me, curled my legs up like a child, yet my mind felt lighter than the woman who had carried too many roles on her shoulders. No longer the perfect sister, no longer the family investor, no longer the wall others leaned on when they were weak, then disappeared the moment they stood tall. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to restore my image. I opened some old photos of Noah and me at 13, sitting on the hood of Dad's rusted car, eating melting ice cream dripping down our hands. I smiled, softly, without bitterness, not because I missed it, but because I had been there. I had loved fully, and I had done my part. But love doesn't sign a lifetime contract with someone who refuses to sign it back. Through everything that happened, I always thought what I needed most was to be seen. To have someone acknowledge, Cassandra, you're not just a wallet. You are a person. But now I realize no one can give me that but me. If I can't believe I have value when I stand alone, then I will forever be begging for permission to exist. And I'm sorry, but I've stopped asking for permission. The next morning, I woke up early, no alarm. The air was still heavy with mist. I walked a full lap around the lake near my house, a place I used to avoid, afraid that slowing down would let the sadness catch up. But that morning, there was no sadness, only wind, and the steady beat of a heart, my own. I came home, brewed coffee, opened my notebook, and wrote one simple line: I don't need to exist in their lives to exist in my own. I don't need to be invited into family photos. I don't need my name in anyone's thank you speech. I've carved my name into the walls I've built with my own 2 hands. I am enough. I am me. And no one can ever erase me with their silence again. That evening, I sat alone. No phone, no emails, no meetings. Just the warm glow of a lamp, a glass of red wine, and the ticking of the clock. And I thought to myself, this is the first silence. I don't want to escape. I used to think my story would end here, that after everything, I would rise, let go, and find peace in silence. The end. But no, there are things you do not just to heal yourself, but unintentionally, to unlock something for others. 3 days after the last article about the Hallbrook wedding cancellation, I received a handwritten letter, not from Noah, not from Mom. It was from Ellie Tran, one of the very first front desk employees I trained at Aurora Grand. She had moved on to work for a high-end travel agency over a year ago. The paper was simple, the ink slightly smudged, and the handwriting was a little shaky. But every sentence, every word, peeled away a layer of the walls around my chest, Cassandra. I remember watching Mrs. Hallbrook publicly scold you just because the napkins were the wrong color during the menu tasting. I remember how you smiled through it and even sent them flowers afterward to thank them. I told myself, I guess that's what being a boss is, swallowing everything just to survive. But when I read about what you did, I cried. Not out of anger, but because, for the first time, I saw a successful woman prove that you don't need to bow down to be respected. Thank you for not staying silent. I'm taking the week off to talk to my mom, the woman who's been treated like a servant in her own home for 30 years. I folded the letter, sat still. Not out of sentimentality, but because I realized my story was never just mine. After that came a flood of messages, emails, hushed conversations in the hotel hallways, and Instagram DMs. A young chef said she'd been called just a server by the bride's family, even though she was the head chef. And after watching me cancel the contract, she finally filed an official report with management. A distant cousin, who had been excluded from his own sister's wedding because his girlfriend didn't fit the vibe, sent me a hesitant thank you message. I thought I was just being difficult. But turns out, I was just the one not chosen. A young entrepreneur asked if she could quote my article in her TEDx talk about women and the unpaid roles they play within families. I didn't reply to them all. Not because I didn't want to, but because I understood. They weren't really speaking to me. They were speaking to the parts of themselves they'd kept hidden, just like I once did. Staying quiet so I wouldn't ruin the mood. Just like I once did, stepping back, believing I was too strong to need defending. Just like I once did, thinking that if I stayed silent long enough, I'd eventually be loved again. But now, I know some truths can only grow when you dare to speak them. And my truth, the one they once dismissed as overreacting, making it personal, blowing things out of proportion, has now become a flashlight in someone else's hand. Not to shine on a stage, but to illuminate the contract. No one read, the bank transfers, no one questioned, and the relationships where giving was taken for granted. I never set out to become a symbol. I just wanted to be respected as a human being. But if that respect opens a door for someone else to walk through, then maybe what I endured wasn't meaningless after all. And for the first time in what feels like forever, I smiled. Not because I won, but because I no longer feel like I'm standing alone. On a Monday morning, I received a call from the Colorado Wedding and Event Services Regulatory Board. The representative, a woman with a soft Western accent, was polite but straightforward. We're currently reviewing Hallbrook Events certification due to multiple complaints about discriminatory practices and lack of transparency in contractual terms. Could you provide us with copies of any correspondence related to the event you canceled? I wasn't surprised. I wasn't pleased either. I simply replied, I'll send everything. But I'm not doing this out of revenge. I just want things to be called by their proper names. At the same time, a nonprofit organization focused on labor rights in the hospitality and service industry invited me to speak at their annual conference. The topic they chose, from the ground up. When the woman standing beneath the wall of fame is the one who built it. I had planned to decline. Spotlights aren't my thing. But then I thought of Ellie. I thought of the young chef who was once called the Help. And I realized staying silent now would also mean becoming complicit. As for Hallbrook Vivian's father, Mr. Richard Hallbrook, was forced to temporarily step down from the board of directors of his luxury auto dealership chain after several partners requested clarification regarding his role in a series of controversial actions. Vivian lost her sponsorship deal with a high-end bridal couture brand after an article titled Bride and Brand, When Money Isn't Class, was shared more than 30,000 times in just 1 week. Marilyn practically disappeared from public events. The woman who used to speak at every charity auction no longer appeared on any guest lists. I didn't celebrate. I didn't sit back, counting the number of times they fell. I just felt. Justice isn't about winning. It's about clarity, about calling things what they are. That doesn't erase the nights I cried. It doesn't bring back the moments when Noah chose someone else's side, but it closes the chapter on twisting the truth. During an internal meeting at Aurora Grand, Anthony, the managing director, stood up in the middle of a staff briefing and said something I'll never forget. When your boss chooses to protect her dignity instead of protecting a contract, that's when you know you're working for a person, not just a brand. The room went silent. Then someone started clapping. It wasn't loud. It was just right. That afternoon, I walked past the largest ballroom in the hotel, the one once reserved for the Hallbrook wedding, now being set up for a corporate seminar. I saw the staff adjusting the lighting, rearranging chairs, placing flowers. A different event, a different purpose. Not glamorous, not pretentious, just real. I stood there, my hand resting on the doorframe. I didn't need to walk in. I didn't need to stand at the center. I'd already done enough to keep this place free of falsehoods, and I told myself I don't need anyone to admit they were wrong. I just need them to know I'll never let it happen again. Someone once asked me, "Do you ever regret it?" For taking things this far, I thought about it for a moment. No. I don't regret telling the truth. I only regret not doing it sooner. A month after everything happened, I reorganized my entire schedule. I turned down 3 major project contracts that, a year ago, I would have signed without hesitation. I chose to keep only what nourished me, not just financially, but emotionally. Aurora Grand kept running, but I was no longer the one responsible for everything. I let other people step up. I trusted them. And for the first time, I also trusted myself enough to let go. I booked a ticket to Florence, not for work, not to scout ideas for a new hotel chain, just to be there, reading books on a balcony, sipping espresso the way it's meant to be, watching sunlight stretch across ancient stone walls. I write down my thoughts not for anyone to read, but simply to live. I didn't reach out to Noah again. He didn't try to reach out either. I think we both understood. Some things don't need forgiveness in order to be released. I didn't bring up Vivian. She'll find a way to restore her reputation. I just hope that she pays for it herself this time, not with someone else's cost. One night, I was sitting on the porch in Portland. The air was just cold enough to wrap a scarf around my neck. I looked out at the Willamette River shimmering under city lights. Soft jazz drifted from a nearby apartment. I pulled out a letter from my leather journal, a letter I'd written to myself 3 years ago. Cass, don't let kindness turn into a habit of being exploited. Don't trade your presence to buy a place in someone else's life. And if the time comes when you must burn the bridge to keep from going back, burn it. Burn it clean. Don't look back. I hadn't had the courage to read it before. Now, it's different. By the end of this journey, I don't feel like I won. I just feel free. Free from the role I was playing. Free from the fear of being left behind. Free from forcing myself to earn love. I used to think growing up meant learning to endure, but now I understand sometimes. Growing up means learning to say, enough, enough hurt, enough bending, enough silence. And when you say enough with absolute calm, the world hears you louder than any scream. If someone is standing on a burning bridge, confused, scared, torn apart, I just want to say this. Some bridges need to be burned, so you can't go back to the place where you lost yourself. And on the other side of that fire, sometimes you finally see the real light for the very first time. If you've ever been the one standing behind the spotlight, only called by name when someone needed something from you, you're not alone. Cassandra's story isn't just about betrayal. It's a map. A guide for anyone who's stayed silent too long, out of fear, out of love, or out of believing they had to endure. But sometimes, the only way to save yourself is to step out of the role you were never meant to play. Thank you for listening until the end. If this story touched something inside you, leave a comment below. We read every single one, and you never know. Your words might be the light someone else needs. And if you're ready, subscribe to Bitter Scars. We still have so many stories to tell with truth and with heart.